So in this segment, we're going to be discussing Starmer really playing into the hands of Nigel Farage with his immigration rhetoric.
I feel is playing into Farage's strengths. Is basically accepting his narrative that all our problems are caused by immigration. Once you're doing it as a big thing in Downing Street, you're basically saying now, judge me on this, okay? Do you want to fix this problem or do you want to exploit this problem? Farage, we know, will exploit any problem that comes along his way. Badenoch and the Tories, they're trying to exploit it as well, trying to get away from the fact that they were responsible for this quadrupling. Once you've made it such a big issue of your leadership, you're going to have very, very good numbers. And the fact is, with somebody like Farage, those numbers are never going to be enough. Why have they set themselves down with this number of net zero?
I mean, they've had this for a while, I think, a one in, one out policy, but they know it's impossible to beat that. It's absolutely impossible to have such a policy.
Answer, partly to play into the climate change debate, which is another of their things, but secondly, there is no immigration that they are going to allow you to define as success.
Which is the point, you define such, you go so far as to say we're going to be way better than these guys, and regardless of how well you do, if you get a B grade in that test, I would have got an A. If you get an A, I'll get an A+. That's the whole point Farage is trying to do, and you bait yourself into his hands here, especially when you're using Downing Street. Imagine he gave a big speech about how he's going to fix the NHS. Imagine that, how different it could have been. But instead, he's going off immigration, which doesn't make any sense. And, that's something Nigel Farage can't run on, the NHS. But, there has to be money put in, it has to be tangible, the difference. And I just don't think they're going to deliver it that much, in all honesty, especially because there's more cuts happening to the NHS as we speak. This rhetoric of, talking about cheap labour and all of this stuff, in terms of workforce. 1 in 8 of our young people aren't in education, employment or training. It's like, bro, you've cut, as Taj Ali points out, you've cut the adult skills budget. So how are people meant to get more training when you're making cuts? You could use things like further education college, trade schools, etc. If you put government funding into them properly, properly make these courses free, you'd see more people take them. But you're not. You don't want. You're not making this accessible for people. Rachel Reeves, her own local party unanimously voted to oppose her disability benefits cuts, 30-0. Like my debate with Bowler Hatman, vote shows growing rebellion within Labour ranks as they plan to write directly to her. The pressure mounts from inside and out, and I don't think there's much that her local Labour Party can do, because she's got a 50% majority. She ain't gonna care. So, it doesn't really change much, but it does show you that people are not happy. People that are members of the party are not happy with what she's doing. And it bears out in kind of the poll numbers as well.
So we know that since the general election, in which Labour didn't get a particularly high share of the vote to start with, it was around a third of the vote, they've dropped to about 25%. Reform have gained up from 14% to 28% in our latest poll. Tories still losing votes and moving into third. But it isn't just a simple case of Labour swapping votes to Reform. They've lost a big chunk to Reform. But they've also lost a chunk to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. And in fact, what's happening to the Labour vote is eerily similar, and I think this is what will worry Number 10, to what happened to Boris Johnson's 2019 coalition, when it splintered in all sorts of different ways. Some people went to Reform, Lib Dem, Labour. You're seeing the same effect now with Labour's vote. And I think the challenge is, what is the glue for that quite disparate coalition on a small share of the vote that gave you a big majority?
The glue before was hatred of the Tory vibe, but when you look at this now, right, there were a lot of, there were some people who would have voted Green who held their nose, voted for Labour because they hated the Tories. Same with the Lib Dems. You ain't going to get that anymore because you've revealed your hand now and you've proved yourself to be not far off the other guys. Really not far off. And so people are going to say, what's the difference between you and the Conservative Party or the Reform Party? I'm just going to vote for the party I actually want to vote for. Because at the end of the day, you can browbeat as much as you want to say, oh, you're a Tory enabler, when you guys were the Tory enablers because you put in a party that has a similar ideology. And that, Bridget Phillipson, she was asked about this.
In 2017, you wrote an article which is still on your website, and there's so much here, but it was very much a pro-immigration article.
Now, for politicians, you can delete stuff off the internet. It doesn't go forever, but it makes people's lives more difficult.
You were accusing others of demonising migrants. And you also said the British public can easily see through politicians who don't themselves believe in what they are saying and who only say what they think the voters want to hear.
So I'm going to go out on a limb here, and she's talking about Theresa May. Probably something to do with Brexit and something to do with Theresa May.
You then went on to say, I believe that in the medium and long term, the public will reward people who stick to their beliefs. What exactly do you and the Labour government believe in?
I believe that migration is an important part of our national story. I wouldn't be sat here today were that not the case.
Do you believe it's an island of strangers? Do you believe it's been squalid? Would you have agreed with that then when you wrote this article in 2017, that kind of language?
So, you know, I've still watched this video. She argues things have changed, etc. But, you know, like, is there a massive difference between now and back then in terms of this island of strangers and nonsense? You know, like, I never understood this. You know, you're mad people speak a foreign language. Why are you upset? You know, do you think they're talking about you? Are you that narcissistic?
Well, a lot has changed since that time. In the last 4 years, we've seen a quadrupling of net migration. That isn't a sustainable level. I've always believed we need clear enforcement of the rules, that people who come here should do so properly.
I mean, they do. You know, if you're talking about illegal immigration, like, be clear in your language. But point being is, like, that's the only route they can have to seek asylum here. You know, if you change the rules or set up a processing centre in France, like people have said to you constantly, you wouldn't have this issue.
And the rules should be enforced. But what the Prime Minister was talking about was the importance of how we build community, that where we work together, where people who come to this country are welcomed and supported, but there's a limit to that in terms of really how realistic we can be about the big increases in net migration that we've seen in recent...
So how much do you want to cut it down to? Because, you know, you could cut it down to 100,000, and those 100,000 could go to, you know, you could end up with 10,000 in one town, if we're talking hypothetically here. Like, it doesn't, you know, what are you doing to integrate people? Are you doing language classes at community centres, for example, you know, helping people learn English? What are you doing specifically to help with integration?
Years. And it is about making sure that we have a clear sense of enforcement where people who don't follow the rules are...
You mentioned rules a lot here. Like, that's the third mention of rules. Like, what rules are not being followed?
Forced to leave if they have no right to be here.
That's already the rules. Like, you know, that's already enforced. Like, people's asylum claims, you know, if they're rejected, most probably they will be deported.
A system of immigration requires the consent of the British people. It requires clear enforcement of the rules that people follow.
So 5 times rules.
With clear expectations. I think that is perfectly...
Yeah, just pathetic. Perfectly pathetic. Sadiq Khan being asked about Starmer's language use.
Now, earlier this week, Keir Starmer gave a speech on immigration. And in that speech, he said that the UK risks turning into an island of strangers unless fair rules on immigration are enforced. Some Labour MPs are saying that that language is echoing what Enoch Powell said in his Rivers of Blood speech when he said that immigration has made the existing population strangers in their own country. Do you feel comfortable with Keir Starmer's language?
Look, my starting point with this conversation is to reflect on my experience as the Mayor of London, as a citizen of this great city and the son of migrants, which is I see on a daily basis the contribution migrants make economically, socially and culturally. I see it when I go to the NHS, when I speak to employees in the financial sector, when I speak to colleagues in Parliament and indeed the government, when I read articles written by journalists and I speak to journalists, when I look at the social care sector, when I look at the legal sector, when I look at the cultural sector. And so that's my experience. I also recognise that, you know, sometimes people use language that I won't use, and I wouldn't use that sort of language, the sort of language that I'm comfortable with. But I do recognise that the Brexiteers made promises that were false. So, for example, when they talked about, inverted commas, taking back control, when they talked about reduced migration, they told a lie, because actually net migration over the last few years has been going up and up and up. And so
that's why they talk about Brexit betrayal. You should talk about why has it been going up? Why didn't the Conservative Party do what they said they would do and get it down to tens of thousands?
I support the government in making sure they've got control of our borders and making sure we reduce net migration.
You have the largest personal mandate of any Labour politician in this country. Do you think it was wise of the Prime Minister to use language which leaves him open to the charge that he was using similar language to Enoch Powell?
I've known Keir for 30 years. He's a million miles away from Enoch.
Well, again, you would think that, but he's decided to copy and paste the language. He's also, the guy who talked about protecting migrants' rights and things like that, and now he's turned on everyone. The guy who seemed very proud to talk about deporting Bengali people, is clearly not the same dude. He has clearly changed.
Powell, but I've been quite clear. That's not the language that I'd use.
Which is fair. I think it's quite a weak response from him, but it's not it, And then you got this dude trying to defend it.
If you read that speech, if you read the passage where that phrase was used, this was a speech which was measured, and in my mind, millions of people across the country will be listening to that speech and nodding along. And I think that's we as the Labour Party and as the Prime Minister have to meet the people where they are, rather than pretending that we're somewhere else.
But would the speech have achieved the same ends without that phrase in it?
Well, I think the media have been focusing on those three words.
Well, you said it. The Prime Minister.
Well, yes, but actually it was part of a pretty long speech. If you read that speech,
that's fine, because a certain amount of people agree with it. That's fine, So it doesn't, because if you go off the if you go off public opinion, right, we should bring back things like the death penalty. Let's bring that back. Should the death penalty be reintroduced for terrorist murder acts? The majority of people agree with that. They will nod along. If Starmer gave a speech saying let's bring back the death sentence, let's do that. So the government is right to make an exception, allow them to be prosecuted where they may receive the death penalty. So okay, let's bring it back. It's so dumb. What you're doing is just feeding Farage. And that's what this whole exercise has been about. When you can't run on the economy properly, when you can't run on the NHS, public services, the things people care about, what else can you run on apart from culture war nonsense? That's what we learnt from the Conservative Party. They had nothing else to run on apart from the culture war, and they fell on the sword of the culture war. And if Labour aren't careful, fair enough, they got some recent economic growth, but if that doesn't translate to better living standards, better public services, you're not going to win the culture war, because you're not going to beat Farage in that area. So it doesn't make sense to go down this road unless you're worried you're not going to have any of the success, because you are going to put off people who are kind of from migrant backgrounds, but also people who don't like this sort of language. You're going to turn them off. They're probably going to vote for the Lib Dems or for the Greens. And where's that going to leave you? With potential Tory voters, potential Reform voters. They ain't going to vote for you because they hate you. Ultimately, you will not deliver the things that they want, which is no migration. They want to deport people. They want minus migration, but you're not going to be able to deliver that power. You'll never be racist enough for them, and that's one of the things that these people are never going to learn until it's too late. But anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.